In the autumn of 1943, a photograph was taken at a field hospital somewhere in New Guinea. It shows a row of American soldiers lying on canvas cots under a thatched roof. They are thin, hollow-eyed, and unmistakably sick. But the first thing you notice is not the sickness, it is the color. Their skin is bright yellow, not jaundiced yellow, not the faint yellowing of liver disease. A vivid, unmistakable, inhuman shade of yellow, as if someone had dipped them in turmeric. Their eyes are yellow, their fingernails are yellow. The whites of their teeth look startlingly bright against the mustard tone of their lips. These men were not dying of some exotic tropical disease. They were being kept alive by one. The yellow was a side effect of a pill. A small, bitter, bright yellow pill that every American soldier in the Pacific Theater was ordered to swallow every single day, under the supervision of officers who would watch him put it in his mouth, watch him chew, and then inspect his mouth to make sure he had actually swallowed it, rather than hiding it under his tongue and spitting it out the moment he turned away. The soldiers hated the pill. They hated its taste, which was bitter enough to make a man gag. They hated the nausea it caused, the headaches, the diarrhea. They hated the color it turned their skin, a yellow so vivid that letters home had to include reassurances that they were not dying of jaundice. They hated the rumors, whispered in the barracks and amplified by enemy propaganda leaflets, that the pill would make them sterile. They devised elaborate schemes to avoid taking it. They hid pills under their tongues, palmed them, flushed them down latrines, traded them for cigarettes, and spit them into their helmets when no one was looking. And the army, with a determination that bordered on the obsessive, forced them to take it anyway. Because the alternative was losing the war. The pill was called Atabrine, and the reason the army had to force-feed it to its own soldiers is one of the strangest, most desperate, and most consequential medical stories of the Second World War. A story about a tree, a parasite, an empire that fell, a drug that nobody wanted to take, a propaganda campaign run by the enemy, and a tiny mosquito that came closer to defeating the United States military than the entire Japanese Imperial Army. The story begins with a tree. Not a famous tree, not an impressive tree, a scraggly, unremarkable tree that grows in the cloud forests of the Andes Mountains in South America, at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. The tree is called cinchona, and for 3 centuries it held a monopoly on the most important medicine in the world. The bark of the cinchona tree contains quinine, a chemical compound that kills the plasmodium parasite that causes malaria. The indigenous Quechua people of Peru had known about the bark's medicinal properties for centuries before Europeans arrived. Spanish missionaries learned of it in the 17th century and brought it back to Europe, where it became the only effective treatment for a disease that had been killing humans since before recorded history. Malaria is not a virus. It is not a bacterium. It is a parasite, a single-celled organism called plasmodium, transmitted by the bite of the female Anopheles mosquito. The mosquito is small, quiet, and nearly invisible at dusk and dawn when it feeds. It does not buzz like a housefly. It slips through gaps in mosquito netting, lands on exposed skin with a touch so light the victim rarely feels it, and inserts a proboscis as thin as a human hair. The bite takes less than a minute. The parasite enters the bloodstream with the mosquito's saliva. What happens next is a biological horror story. The parasites travel to the liver, where they invade liver cells and multiply silently for 1 to 2 weeks, producing no symptoms. Then, they burst out of the liver cells by the tens of thousands, enter the bloodstream, and begin invading red blood cells. Inside each red blood cell, the parasite feeds on hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen, and reproduces asexually until the cell is packed with new parasites. Then, the cell bursts. Millions of red blood cells rupture simultaneously, releasing a wave of parasites that immediately invade new red blood cells, along with a flood of cellular debris and parasite waste products that trigger the immune system into a massive inflammatory response. This is what produces the malaria attack. The sudden, violent onset of chills so severe the patient's teeth chatter, followed by a spiking fever that can reach 106 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by drenching sweats as the fever breaks. The cycle repeats every 48 or 72 hours, depending on the species of Plasmodium, as synchronized waves of red blood cells burst and release their parasitic cargo. Malaria does not always kill, but it always debilitates. A soldier with malaria cannot march, cannot fight, cannot think clearly, cannot stay awake. He shakes with chills so violent that his cot rattles. He sweats through his clothes and his blankets. His temperature spikes to 104 degrees or higher. He is, for all practical purposes, a casualty, as completely removed from the fighting as if he had been shot. And unlike a bullet wound, malaria comes back. Even after the acute episode subsides, the parasite lurks in the liver, and weeks or months later, it attacks again. Some soldiers had malaria recurrences for years after the war. For 300 years, quinine was the only weapon against this parasite. There was no vaccine, there was no alternative drug. There was only the bark of a tree that grew in a few specific places on Earth, ground into powder and dissolved in water. The solution was so unimaginably bitter that the British colonial officers who had to drink it daily in India mixed it with sugar, water, and gin to make it tolerable, thereby inventing the gin and tonic, one of the most popular cocktails in the world, which originated not as a leisure beverage but as a malaria prophylactic. The tonic water you buy today still contains quinine, though in concentrations too low to have any anti-malarial effect. The British Empire ran on quinine. Without it, the colonial administrators, soldiers, and merchants who staffed the outposts of empire in India, Africa, Malaya, and the Caribbean would have been incapacitated by malaria within weeks of arrival. Winston Churchill, with his characteristic flair, once claimed that gin and tonic had saved more English lives and minds than all the doctors in the empire. He was not entirely joking. Every European power that operated in the tropics depended on a steady supply of cinchona bark, and by the early 20th century, the global supply was controlled by a single country, the Netherlands. In the 1850s, the Dutch had pulled off one of the great acts of agricultural espionage in history. They smuggled cinchona seeds out of South America, where the Peruvian and Bolivian governments had attempted to maintain a monopoly on the trees, and established plantations on the island of Java in the Dutch East Indies. The British had attempted the same thing slightly earlier, establishing cinchona plantations in India and Ceylon, but the Dutch operation on Java proved far more successful. The volcanic soil, the precise altitude of the Javanese highlands, and the tropical climate proved ideal for cinchona cultivation. Dutch botanists selectively bred strains of cinchona that produced higher concentrations of quinine than any wild tree. By the early 20th century, Java produced roughly 95% of the world's cinchona bark. The Dutch colonial government controlled the global supply through the Quinine Bureau in Amsterdam, a quasi-governmental organization that processed the bark, extracted the quinine, set the prices, and sold the finished product to pharmaceutical companies and governments worldwide. The Quinine Bureau maintained enormous warehouses in Amsterdam stacked with cinchona bark and processed quinine alkaloids. It was the OPEC of anti-malarial medicine, a monopoly so complete that the rest of the world had essentially stopped trying to develop alternative sources. It was, from a Dutch perspective, a perfect arrangement, a global monopoly on a medicine that every tropical nation needed, administered from a comfortable office in Amsterdam, generating reliable revenue that helped sustain both the colonial enterprise and the Dutch pharmaceutical industry. The world grumbled about the prices, but paid them because there was no alternative.
An American colonel later put it bluntly: the Allies had placed their entire anti-malarial strategy in a single basket, and that basket was sitting on an island in the Pacific that they could not defend. Then, in the space of 18 months, the entire edifice collapsed. 2 hammer blows, falling 6,000 miles apart, shattered the quinine monopoly and created a medical crisis that threatened to determine the outcome of the largest war in history.
In May 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch government fled to London. The Quinine Bureau, its warehouses full of cinchona bark and processed quinine, and its manufacturing facilities fell into Nazi hands. Germany now controlled the processed quinine stocks in Europe and could distribute them to its own military and its allies while denying them to the Allies. In January 1942, Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies. The campaign was swift and devastating. Dutch colonial forces, outnumbered and outgunned, collapsed within weeks. By March, Java was under Japanese occupation. The cinchona plantations, every last tree in the carefully tended highland forests that the Dutch had cultivated for nearly a century, every seed, every pound of harvested bark stored in plantation warehouses, now belonged to the Japanese Empire. In a single stroke, Japan had captured 95% of the world's supply of the only proven treatment for the most debilitating tropical disease on Earth. The Allies were now fighting a war across the most malarial region of the planet without the medicine that had protected armies in the tropics for 300 years. It was as if an army had entered a battlefield and discovered that all the antibiotics in the world were in the enemy's medicine cabinet. The timing was catastrophic. The United States had just entered the war. The Pacific theater was overwhelmingly tropical. The islands where American soldiers would fight, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Bougainville, the Philippines, Borneo, Okinawa, were some of the most malarial places on the planet, and the medicine that had protected soldiers from malaria for 3 centuries was now in the hands of the enemy. An Australian colonel named N. Hamilton Fairley, one of the leading malaria researchers in the Allied forces, paid in advance for the last 100 tons of cinchona bark loaded onto a tramp freighter on the docks at Surabaya just before Java fell. The ship never arrived. The bark and the quinine it contained was lost. The Australian army was left with less than a year's supply. America had even less. There was one desperate attempt to secure a future supply of natural quinine. Colonel Arthur Fisher managed to smuggle a small quantity of cinchona seeds out of the Philippines just before the islands fell to the Japanese. The plan was to grow the seeds into trees on plantations in Central and South America that could eventually replace the Javanese supply. But cinchona trees take 5 to 7 years to mature to the point where their bark can be harvested. Fisher's seeds, even if successfully grown, would not produce usable quinine until 1947 at the earliest. The war could not wait 5 years for a tree to grow. The solution had to be chemical, not botanical. It had to come from a factory, not a plantation. And it had to come now. The scale of the malaria crisis in 1942 is difficult to comprehend without numbers, and the numbers are staggering. In the Philippines, as American and Filipino forces fought a desperate retreating action against the Japanese invasion, roughly 24,000 of the 75,000 defenders were incapacitated by malaria. 1 in 3 soldiers was too sick to fight, not from wounds, but from a mosquito bite. The retreats were so chaotic that large stores of medical supplies, including quinine, were abandoned. Men who needed the drug could not get it because it was sitting in a warehouse that the Japanese had captured. On Guadalcanal, where the Marines landed in August 1942 in the first major American ground offensive of the Pacific War, malaria struck with a ferocity that stunned the medical corps. The operation had been codenamed Shoestring because everything was in short supply: food, ammunition, medical equipment, and anti-malarial drugs. The Navy's disastrous defeat at the Battle of Savo Island in August forced the withdrawal of supply ships, leaving the Marines on the beach with whatever they had already unloaded.
Quinine supplies were meager and quickly exhausted. Atabrine was available in limited quantities, but at dosages that had not yet been optimized. The Marines fought the Japanese during the day and fought the mosquitoes at night. The Anopheles mosquito on Guadalcanal bred in the swamps and streams that crisscrossed the island, and the monsoon rains created standing water everywhere. Mosquito nets were in short supply. Insect repellent was primitive. The troops, exhausted from combat, malnourished from inadequate rations, and weakened by dysentery from contaminated water, had immune systems that were already compromised before the parasite entered their blood.
8,000 men of the 1st Marine Division contracted malaria before they were relieved in December. Nearly 69% of the 2nd Marine Division fell victim. One estimate suggests that every single man who served on Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943 contracted the disease at some point. Tropical diseases disabled 2/3 of the Marines on the island. Wounds from enemy fire accounted for only 1/3. Read that again. Malaria was twice as effective at removing American soldiers from combat as the Japanese military. At Milne Bay in New Guinea, 10% of the Allied force was developing new malaria infections every week. At that rate, a medical officer calculated, the entire force would have been combat ineffective within 2 months. Had the Japanese landed their naval assault force a few months later, when malaria had gutted the Australian garrison, the outcome might have been very different. Across the entire Pacific theater, between 1941 and 1945, approximately 572,950 American soldiers contracted malaria. 60% of all troops who served in the Pacific reported having the disease at some point. The hospitalization rate in the Southwest Pacific in 1943 was such that 30% of all Army hospital admissions were for malaria. Some soldiers were hospitalized multiple times. Some had recurrences for years after the war ended. The Japanese suffered equally, and in some cases worse. On Buna in New Guinea, an estimated 45% of Japanese soldiers died from malaria. Some Japanese units were 90% combat ineffective due to a combination of malaria and dysentery. The difference that would ultimately decide the outcome of the Pacific War was that the Americans found a replacement for quinine. The Japanese did not. The replacement had been invented in Germany in 1931. This fact alone contains layers of irony that the wartime generation would have appreciated. German pharmaceutical giant Bayer, the same company that had invented aspirin, had synthesized a compound called quinacrine as part of a decades-long research program to develop synthetic alternatives to quinine. Germany had no tropical colonies after losing them in the First World War and no access to cinchona bark, so German chemists had been working on the problem with characteristic thoroughness since the 1920s. The program was driven not by military planning, but by commercial logic. If Germany could produce a synthetic anti-malarial, it could sell it to the colonial powers who needed it and free itself from dependence on a Dutch monopoly. Quinacrine, marketed under the brand name Atabrine, was the most successful product of this research program. It was effective against the malaria parasite, disrupting the plasmodium's ability to digest hemoglobin inside the red blood cells. It could be mass-produced from chemical precursors that were available industrially without any need for cinchona bark or quinine. It was, in pharmaceutical terms, a genuine breakthrough. It also had side effects that made soldiers despise it with a passion that surprised even the medical officers who prescribed it. The most visible was the yellowing of the skin. Atabrine accumulated in the tissues over time, binding to proteins and lipids in a way that gave the skin a vivid yellow discoloration that could not be washed off, sweated off, or disguised. The effect was temporary, fading weeks after the drug was discontinued, but while a soldier was taking his daily dose, he looked like a character from a science fiction movie. The yellowing was not harmful, but it was profoundly unsettling to men who were already far from home, already frightened, and already sick of everything about the Pacific.
Young men who had been tanned and healthy-looking a few weeks earlier now appeared jaundiced and alien. They wrote home to their families, assuring them that the yellow was from a pill, not from disease. Their families did not always believe them. The soldiers called the pill the yellow peril. They called it the jaundice maker. They called it names that cannot be printed, and they devised elaborate strategies to avoid taking it. Beyond the color, Atabrine caused nausea, headaches, and diarrhea. When it was first introduced at Guadalcanal, the recommended dose of 0.2 grams per day caused a full 20% of the American division to become ill with the side effects, including the division's commander, Major General Alexander Patch. The dosage was quickly reduced to 0.05 grams, which most soldiers could tolerate without becoming sick. But the damage to Atabrine's reputation was done. Soldiers who had seen their buddies vomiting after taking the pill concluded that the cure was worse than the disease. And then there were the rarer, more terrifying effects. In a small percentage of cases, Atabrine caused neurological symptoms, vivid nightmares, heightened anxiety, and in rare instances, full-blown psychosis. Soldiers who were already under extreme psychological stress from combat found themselves experiencing hallucinations, paranoid episodes, or violent mood swings that they attributed to the yellow pill. The incidence of psychosis was eventually determined to be roughly 0.1%, an extremely low rate. But in a unit of 1,000 men, that meant one soldier losing his mind in a way that everyone could see. One case of Atabrine psychosis in a battalion did more to undermine compliance than 1,000 informational posters could repair. Researchers eventually discovered that these side effects could be greatly reduced by giving soldiers a large initial priming dose, followed by smaller daily maintenance doses. The priming dose saturated the tissues and established a baseline concentration that the daily pill maintained. Under this regimen, the side effects were manageable for the vast majority of soldiers, but convincing men who had already heard the horror stories was an uphill battle. And then there were the rumors. Japanese propaganda, dropped in leaflets over American positions, claimed that Atabrine caused permanent sexual impotence and infertility. The claim was completely false, but it struck at the deepest anxieties of young men far from home, and it spread through the ranks like the malaria it was meant to prevent. Soldiers who might have tolerated yellow skin and nausea drew the line at the possibility of never being able to have children. The rumor was so effective and so persistent that the army had to devote significant resources to debunking it. Whether the Japanese deliberately planted the impotence rumor or whether it arose spontaneously among the troops and was then amplified by Japanese psychological operations is a matter of historical debate. What is not debatable is its effect. Non-compliance with Atabrine regimens was a major problem throughout 1942 and into 1943. Units that did not enforce mandatory consumption saw malaria rates that were orders of magnitude higher than units that did. The Army's response was a combination of force and persuasion. The force was straightforward. Officers and medics were ordered to supervise Atabrine consumption at every meal. A soldier would go through the chow line, receive his food, and then be handed a yellow pill by a medic or a WAC, a member of the Women's Army Corps. He would place the pill in his mouth, the medic would watch him chew and swallow, then the medic would inspect his mouth, checking under the tongue, behind the teeth, in the cheeks. If the pill was found hidden, the soldier was disciplined. In some units, surprise inspections were conducted. Officers would appear without warning and order men to open their mouths for examination. The persuasion was more creative. The Army produced propaganda of its own, including a famous series of posters and pamphlets created in part by Captain Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. Geisel's cartoons featured a character called Anne, a personified mosquito, in a booklet titled, "This is Anne, She Drinks Blood." The text, written by Monroe Leaf, warned soldiers in slang-heavy language that Anne could knock them flat and urged them to use their nets and take their pills. On Guadalcanal, the Armed Forces Radio Service created a program called the Atabrine Cocktail Hour, which aired daily at 5:30 p.m. and featured 15 minutes of music from imaginary venues like the fungus-festooned Fern Room and the Starlight Roof high atop the Hotel de Grinck in downtown Guadalcanal. It was gallows humor, but it worked. It reminded soldiers, in a tone they could relate to, that taking the pill was not optional. In one particularly grim display, the 3073rd Station Hospital at Port Moresby, New Guinea, posted a sign flanked by two human skulls. The sign read simply, "These men didn't take their Atabrine."
By mid-1943, the combination of enforcement, education, and pharmaceutical scaling had turned the tide. The Winthrop Chemical Company, the American manufacturer of Atabrine, had ramped up production to staggering levels. In 1943, they delivered 1.8 billion doses. In 1944, 2.5 billion. The American pharmaceutical industry, which had entered the war with no significant anti-malarial production capacity, was now producing enough Atabrine to dose every soldier in the Pacific every day, with enough left over to supply the Australians, the British, and the other allies fighting in tropical theaters. The effect was dramatic. Malaria rates in the South Pacific, which had been measured in thousands of cases per thousand troops per year in 1942, dropped steadily through 1943 and 1944. On Guadalcanal, where the initial malaria rate had been catastrophic, an extensive control program was established. Malaria survey units mapped mosquito breeding sites across the island. Larviciding teams sprayed the breeding grounds with insecticide. Beginning in 1944, DDT, the revolutionary new insecticide, was used for residual spraying of buildings and living quarters. A 90-square-mile troop bivouac area was established, and no organization was permitted to camp outside it without special authorization. The results were dramatic. By 1945, malaria on Guadalcanal was no longer a significant problem. The same pattern was repeated across the Pacific as the Americans advanced. Each island that was captured became a laboratory for malaria control. Survey units arrived with the assault troops, identified mosquito habitats, and began control measures immediately. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal were applied at Bougainville, at Treasury Island, at Munda. By the time the Americans reached the Philippines and Okinawa, the malaria control infrastructure was a well-oiled machine. Dedicated malaria control units, numbering thousands of personnel, operated alongside the combat forces. They sprayed, they drained, they enforced Atabrine compliance, and they kept the army on its feet. By June 1945, the malaria rate had dropped to 9 cases per thousand troops. Over 75% of soldiers had been taken off Atabrine entirely because the environmental controls had reduced the mosquito threat to manageable levels. The integrated approach, chemical prophylaxis combined with environmental control and enforced discipline, had achieved what no single measure could have accomplished alone. Units that enforced strict Atabrine compliance saw rates drop to near zero. The disease that had threatened to halt the Pacific Campaign had been brought under control, not by eliminating the mosquito, not by avoiding the jungle, but by flooding the bloodstreams of 1 million soldiers with a synthetic chemical that turned their skin yellow and made them nauseous, but kept the parasite from multiplying. The contrast with the Japanese is what decided the war. Japan had captured the world's quinine supply when it took Java, but having the trees and using them effectively were two different things. The Japanese occupation disrupted the Dutch plantation system. The skilled Dutch chemists and managers who had operated the Quinine Bureau were gone, imprisoned, or fled. Japanese pharmaceutical production could not process the cinchona bark into quinine at the scale the pre-war Dutch system had achieved. More critically, Japan's supply lines to its forward bases were being systematically destroyed by American submarines and aircraft. Even when quinine was available in the home islands or on Java, getting it to the soldiers fighting on Guadalcanal or New Guinea or Bougainville required a supply chain that was under constant attack. Ships carrying medical supplies were sunk. Submarines that might have carried quinine were diverted to combat missions. The logistics system that connected Tokyo to the front lines was stretched to the breaking point and beyond. The result was that Japanese soldiers in the Pacific fought without adequate anti-malarial medication. The consequences were devastating and grew worse as the war continued. On Buna, 45% of the garrison died from malaria. On other islands, Japanese units were rendered 90% combat ineffective by the combination of malaria and dysentery.
As American submarine warfare strangled Japan's maritime supply lines, the trickle of quinine that reached forward positions slowed to nothing. Japanese soldiers on isolated island garrisons, cut off from resupply, watched their comrades waste away from a disease that their own empire had the cure for but could not deliver. The irony was savage. Japan had gone to war in part to secure the natural resources of Southeast Asia. It had captured the rubber plantations, the tin mines, the oil fields, and the cinchona plantations. But capturing a resource is not the same as using it. Japan's shipping was being sunk faster than it could be replaced. Its pharmaceutical industry was unable to process cinchona bark at the scale the Dutch had achieved. And the frontline troops who were dying of malaria were dying because the medicine that could have saved them was sitting in a warehouse on Java, an island they controlled, that they could not ship it from because the sea lanes were closed. This was Japan's great mistake, though calling it a mistake implies that there was an alternative. Japan captured the cinchona plantations but could not exploit them effectively because its industrial and logistical capacity was inadequate. It had the raw material but not the processing capacity, the distribution system, or the scientific infrastructure to turn bark into medicine at the scale the war demanded. America, by contrast, had no cinchona but had the pharmaceutical industry, the chemical engineering expertise, and the manufacturing capacity to produce a synthetic alternative in quantities that dwarfed anything the pre-war quinine industry had achieved. The war in the Pacific was decided not just by aircraft carriers and battleships and island assaults. It was decided in a chemical company in New York producing 2.5 billion pills a year and an Army medical corps that forced every soldier to swallow one every day. It was decided in the bloodstream.
The parallel program that ran alongside the Atabrine campaign was one of the largest drug discovery efforts in history, and it produced a result that would outlast the war by decades. Funded by the Office of Scientific Research and Development, American researchers screened approximately 14,000 chemical compounds for anti-malarial activity during the war. The program was methodical, exhaustive, and relentless. Compounds were synthesized in university laboratories, tested in animal models, and then, when promising candidates were identified, tested in human subjects, often volunteers from prisons or military bases. The ethical standards of these trials would not meet modern requirements, but the urgency was genuine and the stakes were existential. Among the thousands of compounds tested was one that had actually been synthesized by Bayer in Germany in the 1930s, but set aside in favor of Atabrine because initial tests suggested it was too toxic. The compound was called chloroquine. American researchers, re-examining it with more sophisticated testing protocols, discovered that the earlier toxicity concerns had been overstated. Chloroquine was more effective than Atabrine against the malaria parasite. It had fewer and milder side effects, and crucially, it did not turn the patient's skin yellow. Had chloroquine been available in 1942, the entire compliance nightmare of the Atabrine program could have been avoided. But chloroquine was not available in 1942. It was available by 1945. And in the post-war years, it became the drug of choice for malaria prevention and treatment worldwide, one of the true miracle drugs of the 20th century. Chloroquine's impact extended far beyond the military. The World Health Organization adopted it as the centerpiece of its global malaria eradication program in the 1950s and 60s. For decades, it was the most widely used anti-malarial drug on the planet, affordable, effective, and easy to administer. It saved millions of lives in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, transforming the disease from a leading cause of death in the tropics to a manageable public health challenge. The wartime drug discovery program that produced it, born from the desperation of a military that had lost its quinine and was losing its soldiers, was one of the most consequential medical research efforts in history. The irony is that chloroquine had been sitting in a Bayer laboratory filing cabinet for a decade before anyone realized what it could do. The war forced the search found the answer, and the answer had been there all along. Today, malaria still kills over 600,000 people per year, the overwhelming majority of them children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. The Plasmodium parasite has developed resistance to chloroquine in many regions, rendering the miracle drug of the 1950s ineffective in precisely the places where it is most needed. The search for new antimalarials continues, an echo of the wartime scramble that produced Atabrine and chloroquine. Artemisinin, derived from sweet wormwood, a Chinese herbal remedy, and developed by the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Tu Youyou, is now the frontline treatment. But resistance to artemisinin has already appeared in Southeast Asia, and the cycle of drug, resistance, and new drug continues as it has for centuries. The mosquito, meanwhile, has proven as difficult to defeat as any human enemy. DDT, which was so effective during the war and in the post-war eradication campaigns, was banned for agricultural use in many countries due to environmental concerns. Mosquito nets treated with insecticide have saved millions of lives, but cannot be universally distributed. Vaccine development has been painfully slow. The first malaria vaccine, RTS-S, was recommended by the WHO only in 2021, and its efficacy is modest. The parasite is too cunning, too adaptable, too deeply woven into the ecology of the tropical world to be easily eradicated. The Quinine story of 1942 is a reminder that wars are not won only by the weapons you build, but by the diseases you prevent. General Douglas MacArthur, whose command encompassed the worst malarial zones of the Pacific, understood this better than most. His medical officers told him bluntly that if the malaria situation was not brought under control, the efficiency of the entire army would be so impaired that it would be unable to perform its combat functions. They added, with the candor that only a crisis permits, that if sufficient antimalarials could not be secured, all other supplies, with the exception of rations, would be of little or no value. Without medicine, the bullets and the bombs were useless because there would be no one healthy enough to fire them. The United States came within months of losing the ability to fight in the Pacific, not because of Japanese naval superiority or superior tactics, but because a parasite carried by a mosquito was removing soldiers from the battlefield faster than the enemy could. The response, a massive pharmaceutical mobilization, a forced medication program, and a wartime drug discovery effort that screened 14,000 compounds, was as important to the Allied victory as any weapons program except the Manhattan Project. The soldiers whose skin turned yellow did not choose to take the pill. They were ordered to. Many of them resented it. Many tried to avoid it. But the yellow skin was the mark of a man who was being kept alive and combat effective by a chemical that tasted terrible, looked worse, and worked. The army did not have the luxury of waiting for a better drug. It had the drug it had. It forced its soldiers to take it, and it won. 70 million doses a month, 2.5 billion in a year. Every one of them swallowed under the watchful eye of a medic who checked the soldier's mouth afterward. Every one of them a tiny act of compliance that, multiplied by 1 million men across thousands of islands, added up to the difference between an army that could fight and an army that could not. The Japanese had the quinine trees. The Americans had the pill factories. The trees could not be moved. The pills could go anywhere. And in a war fought across the widest ocean on Earth, on islands separated by thousands of miles of open water, the ability to produce a medicine in New York and deliver it to a foxhole in New Guinea was worth more than all the cinchona bark on Java. The quinine was in the enemy's hands, the atabrine was in the soldier's mouth, and the soldier's skin turned yellow, and he cursed the pill, and he cursed the medic who made him take it, and he cursed the mosquitoes and the jungle and the rain. But he did not get malaria. And because he did not get malaria, he could fight. And because he could fight, the island was taken, and the next island after that, and the next, until the war was won. A yellow pill, the size of an aspirin, bitter as defeat, swallowed under duress by men who did not trust it, that kept the American army on its feet across the Pacific for 3 years. That is the weapon nobody talks about. That is the victory nobody sees. 2.5 billion doses. Every one of them a small, yellow act of war. And somewhere in a museum in Papua New Guinea, or in a footlocker in an attic in Ohio,
Or in a display case at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, there is a small brown bottle with a faded label that reads Atabrine, quinine hydrochloride. Inside the bottle, if you open it, you will find a handful of small yellow tablets, each one a relic of a war that was fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with bitter pills and stubborn compliance. On islands where the jungle was as dangerous as the enemy and where the difference between victory and defeat was not always a matter of firepower, but of pharmacology. A tree in Java, a parasite in the blood, a pill in the mouth, a war in the balance. And the skin of 1 million soldiers turned bright yellow under the tropical sun of the Pacific, marking them not as sick men, but as men who were being kept alive by chemistry, one bitter dose at a time.